All right, guys, welcome to the Melbourne Reformation Society. It's a pretty cold and gloomy day where we are in Melbourne, Victoria, at the moment. It's probably sunny for a whole bunch of our other participants who are in other places that are more tropical. But welcome to the Reformation Society. The Reformation Society here in Melbourne is a ministry of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. They've got these societies all over the world. And if you don't know about the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, their vision as a ministry is to recover the gospel through the reformation of the local church or local churches. And they have two ways of doing that. One is through their partner churches, and the other way is through these Reformation societies. And these Reformation societies are comprised of churchmen, pastors, leaders, teachers, and and lay people from different churches who come together, who pray for Reformation, who study the scriptures, who study theology and history, and all sorts of things in order to edify and strengthen the local church. So the hope is, the prayer is that these types of things that we learn here would be taken back home to our local churches and applied, and that it would edify you as an individual also. Obviously, our local churches aren't meeting right now, and it's a sad thing, but it is still the Lord's Day tomorrow, and we look forward to that. So today's quite special. If you were here the past two sessions, we talked about the importance of creeds and confessions, especially in the life of the church. And this is a bit of an excursus. It's still related, but it's a slightly different topic. And we're very blessed to have a guest teacher, our dear friend John Lee. Now, John is in the screen right now. You guys could probably see him. If you want it to be easier for you, you can put your Zoom on speaker view instead of gallery view so that you get whoever's speaking to pop up on your screen. John is currently the assistant to the principal in the Reformed Theological College in Australia, which is where I'm taking up my studies. And he's a doctoral candidate at the Free University of Amsterdam, and he's done his master's at Westminster Seminary, California, as well. So he's going to be speaking to us about a really interesting topic today, and that is academy and church, or the relationship between the academy and the church. And specifically, he's going to be talking about the contributions of the Reformed scholastics. So if you don't know what in the world scholasticism, especially Reformed scholasticism, is, John will explain all of that to you. And if you want to know what the relationship is between the church and the academy, seminaries, schools, formal education, then you're in for a treat, because John's going to explain that as well. Just a couple of ground rules. We have you guys all on mute, but John will be asking some questions along the way. He might ask you to read a thing or two. So I'm going to give you the ability to unmute yourselves. Please don't unmute yourselves randomly. Don't go to the bathroom and unmute yourselves. Don't do any of that. But yeah, if you're called upon and if you're available, if you have a voice, please do participate. And we'll also open the floor for questions a little bit later on. John will take care of that, and he'll tell you when it's time to ask questions. But alternatively, if you want to ask some things in the middle of this discussion, I encourage you to type it into the chat box. If you don't know where the chat box is, look for it now. Type it to everyone in the chat box. If you want to type it privately to me, that's fine as well. I will collate those questions, and when it's question and answer time, I'm going to go ahead and recite those and ask those to John. So he's going to have a few segments, and in between those segments, he'll give you some time to reflect and to ask questions. And we'll also have a 10-minute break in the middle of this entire thing.
Well, first of all, thank you, Josh, for giving me this opportunity. It was really good for me to revisit this topic, the topic that I really like to learn more about. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the preparation, and I would like to thank all of you for joining today as well. And I have to say that I've never taught anything on Zoom before, so this whole experience is quite new to me. But I hope you still benefit from today's session nonetheless. Just a couple of points before we go into the main parts. First, So I plan to have a 10-minute break, as George said, to have a 10-minute break at around 4 o'clock. So after, let's say, 50 minutes or so. And I might do that after the first part, which I will introduce in a second, because I think I'll spend a bit longer time on that and shorten other parts. So you can expect to have a break at around 4 o'clock. And if we finish the first part sooner, then I'll push through and have a break after the second part. And secondly, if you find anything unclear due to my broken English or even lagging, please feel free to ask for clarifications, and I'll try my best to answer and clarify that. So please do that. And I have to say that I'm still a student of this field, so there are lots of things that I do not know yet. But I will still try my best to say a few helpful things so you can clarify your thoughts. Now, as you can see on the screen, my topic for today's session is titled Academy and Church, Reformed Scholastic Contributions. And as you can see from the title, we'll be looking at the relationship between theological academies like universities, seminaries, or theological colleges and churches. Because I think this relationship is something we need to pay attention to if we want to have a longer view of Reformation. Now, one of the popular topics in theology is political theology, right? Some of you might already have a strong interest in political matters, and that's absolutely fine. Ever since the publication of, Augustine's City of God in the early part of the 5th century, Christians have been thinking, systematically and theologically about how Christians should live in the world as citizens of heaven, and also how church and state should function in this world. So political theology has been a popular and important field within theological studies for a very long time. And, especially in this day and age, I definitely can see the positive values that this political theology can bring to theological studies. But in my view, this is just me thinking here. In my view, only a small number of Christians today are interested in knowing how church and academy should relate to each other. Lots of them understand, that the church and state relationship is an important one, and even a perennial topic for Christian theology. But perhaps only academics, I think, seem to be interested in reflecting on the church and academy relationship. And by academy, I don't mean, primary schools or secondary schools. I mean tertiary and graduate schools that provide, ministerial training and advanced theological research. And compared to how serious ordinary Christians tend to think about, what the government ought to do, I think their sense of what theological colleges ought to do is often not that refined or not that sharpened enough, I think. Many Christians are detached from the life of theological colleges and do not usually see, what kind of engagements there should be between, theological colleges and the churches they serve. But if we think about it, when the cities in Europe declared themselves to be Protestant rather than Roman Catholics in the Reformation period, by the way, I'm just assuming that you can see the screen and look at the slide. When the cities in Europe became Protestants, they soon reformed their representative universities as well. Because the universities back then were state-supported, and depending on the direction of the state, a theological position of the state, their educational direction often changed too. So the Reformation did not, if you look at the picture here, countries like Scotland, England, cities like Amsterdam, Strasbourg, Geneva in the Switzerland, and France, some parts of France, and also in Hungary, and a small portion of that land in Ireland too. You will see these cities turned Reformed by adopting Reformed confessions. And what they, in the process of reforming their cities, they did not just adopt the confessions to reform the churches, but also reform the universities there as well. So the Reformation did not stop at reforming churches and states, but they also reformed universities too. And I think without linking the Reformation to academies and universities, we won't have a full picture of the scope of Reformation. So, but more plainly, I think, this is an important topic because, if theological colleges go liberal, then the people who are educated there will almost inevitably go liberal too. Right? Look at Princeton Theological Seminary. It was the bastion of Orthodox Calvinistic Reformed theology, but after the liberalization, so to speak, it became now one of the premier liberal seminaries in the United States. And the opposite is true as well. If theological colleges go to a conservative direction, then the people there, people who are educated there, would almost go conservative too. And, of course, there are exceptions and different degrees of receptions by students. But nonetheless, the influence of theological colleges and on churches is very big. It's just immense. So I wanted to spend this time to deepen our understanding of this topic, the topic of academy and church. Academies have been, very powerful in the powerful and influential instruments of reforming churches and sustaining the life of Reformed churches. And I hope this session will give you some clarity about how they should collaborate in the work of ministry. So to that end, let me give you a bird's eye view of what I'm going to share with you today. So let me present to you up front one main thesis I'll be trying to communicate throughout my talk. By the end of the session, if you are somewhat confused about, any of my material, then please remember this main point and you will have clarity about what we did today. And the main point is this, as you can see on the screen. Many Reformed scholastic theologians were positive contributors to the development of Reformed confessional and Catholic theology. And let me repeat this. Many Reformed scholastic theologians were positive contributors to the development of Reformed confessional and Catholic theology. And here I could have added covenantal theology as well, because Reformed scholastics did indeed contribute significantly, to the development of covenant theology, but to fit everything into the time we have, I skipped that part, but I will just focus on their contributions to confessional and Catholic theology today. And I intentionally put many rather than all, because some scholastics or university professors like Jacob Arminius, the famous Jacob Arminius, did produce not so positive fruits as an academic theologian. The whole Reformed Church in the Netherlands in the early part of the 17th century had to face significant challenges because of his theology. And so I have to say that not all scholastics were positive contributors. And to help you form some practical insights along the way, one reflection I want to share with you will be this. Reformed churches and academies can build a healthy relationship when both hold fast to the Reformed confessions. And I hope this is one of the takeaways you gained from today's session. And please feel free to share more at the end if you have any other ideas that we can benefit from. And if we, somewhat run out of time and can't have longer discussion on this point, I hope you can still, ruminate on this and think about how seminaries and churches should relate to each other, and how you can help them, help have healthier relationships. All right, so to discuss the main point, I will divide my talk into 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk about a few key universities, their professors, and I will speak a little bit about their curriculum. Part 2, I'm going to speak on Reformed Scholasticism and its contribution to confessional theology. Part 3, Reformed Scholasticism and Catholic theology. And conclusion, we will just wrap up by trying to think a little bit more clearly about what kind of relationship there should be between academy and church. So we're going to look at these 3 topics today, and I hope you can gain helpful insights on these issues from today's session. So I just plan to go directly to the first part, but do you guys have any questions before we go to the first part?
By the way, guys, if you'd like to ask, you could use the raise hand option if you would like. If you're on your phone, that's on the options. And same thing also on your laptop. You can use the raise hand reaction.
And if I miss your question, Joshua will pick it up and just bring it up. So I'm going to be interrupted. So good.
We've got one question from Ian. So go ahead, Ian. I'm unmuting you.
Why do we have to talk about Catholic theology?
Oh, good question. So the word Catholic here does not mean Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. It's quite unfortunate that Roman Catholic Church claims that word as a distinctive part of that branch of Christianity. But here I'm thinking precisely about the universal. So in the sense of how Reformed university professors thought about their identity as a Christian thinkers, and what kind of unity they pursued with the theologians that preceded them. So this is not, we're not talking about Roman Catholic theology. Like I'm not arguing that Reformed Scholastic theologians or professors basically ended up helping developing Roman Catholic theology. That's not my point. But Catholic theology here refers to the kind of belief that Christ Church as a whole believed throughout centuries. So it's a positive sense, I have to say.
Thanks for the clarification, John. So Catholic as in universal church, not Roman.
Yes.
So no more questions. You may go ahead.
Yeah, all right. So let me start with this definition of the term. Reformed Scholasticism refers to the use of academic method in theological education by Reformed university professors in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Now, this is a lengthy definition of the term, but I think this is comprehensive enough to capture some of the essential components of the movement. Reformed Scholasticism refers to the use of academic method in theological education by Reformed university professors in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. But to simplify this even more, I want to highlight 2 keywords from here, 2 keywords, and they are academic method. Academic method. So Reformed Scholastic theology is fundamentally an academic form of theology. So when we say Reformed Scholastic theology, we're referring to the academic theology that was developed and taught in the context of Reformed universities or theological colleges, if you will, during the Reformation and post-Reformation period. This theology is distinguishable from the kind of theology that, that's expressed in sermons, letters, or even in devotional writings, because this is a highly technical theology that was taught at universities for university students who had who were there to finish academic degrees. So this is a very academic, formal, and technical theology. So to give you a more refined definition of the term, I should introduce what the authoritative scholar on this topic defined, how he defined the movement. So his name is Richard Muller, as you can see on the screen, and he's a retired seminary professor in America, and he basically changed the whole scholarship on Reformed scholasticism or post-Reformation Reformed theology. And I have to say that he's simply one of the most gigantic theologians and scholars alive today. And this is how he basically defined the word scholasticism or scholastic. Instead of me saying this, can I please have one volunteer read this for us? Does anyone?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and choose. Go ahead, Ilya.
Thus, scholastic indicates an academic style and method of discourse, not a particular theology or philosophy. The denominator, Reformed Scholastic, refers to a writer or a document belonging, confessionally, to the Reformed as distinct from the Lutheran wing of the magisterial Reformation and characterized by the use of an academic or scholastic method.
Thank you, Ilya. That was great. So the key characteristic of this theology or movement, if you will, is that it was written by academics in the context of universities for students studying for academic degrees. So when you engage with these Reformed scholars or professors, you will see a certain academic pattern, the kind of pattern that was widespread in the day and widely used by academics in the early modern period, spanning from late 15th until the 18th century. So to get some concrete examples of this, let me show you some of the influential universities, and I have to change my screen, so just bear with me for a moment. Can everybody see this website? Yeah.
Yeah, we see. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So this is the website called Post-Reformation Digital Library. I hope you can follow my cursor. The fonts are very small, so just try to follow along by following the cursor here. Post-Reformation Digital Library. What is this website about? Here, if you look at this section here, the Post-Reformation Digital Library, or PRDL for short, is a select database of digital books relating to the development of theology and philosophy during the Reformation and post-Reformation period, or early modern era. Late medieval and patristic works printed and referenced in the early modern era are also included. The PRDL is a project of the Junius Institute for Digital Reformation Research. Now, this website is like a candy store for people like myself who basically love to know more about Reformed scholasticism, and I'm pretty sure you can see why this is the case. So this is PRDL, and if you look at if you look at the number here on the far right corner, the website has about 135,000 volumes of Latin and English works. So this is a massive website when it comes to storage. Now, why am I showing you this? Let me click Scholastica here on the left. I hope you can see this, Scholastica. If you click this, you'll get to an amazing page. Now, if you click Scholastica here, it basically gives you a few, not just a few, but many influential early modern academies and universities. Now we'll get to some of the schools here, but let me read a few sentences from here. The academy in early modern Europe, by the way, this is the point I want to make as well. The academy in early modern Europe was an institution of significant social, intellectual, and spiritual development. Schools were instrumental for the success of reform and counter-reform movements, both for the dissemination and sharpening of academic discourse, as well as the popularization of piety here through pastoral education. The Scholastica project is an attempt to recognize these aspects of early modern period in existing and new tools for historical research. Now, I'll probably skip the other parts. Now, I think this website, this page specifically, is a great way to introduce to you some of the most influential universities or academies for the Reformed and also Lutheran sides. And I want to do an exercise here. I want to focus on these two rows, starting with Edinburgh, and I don't know how to pronounce this, but basically the third row here. Okay, I hope you can see this. Now, the little exercise I want to do with you is, if you look at this row, just look at this row. Sorry for the small font, but if you look at this row, the second one, what are the top 3 universities that had the most number of faculty members from this row here? So I'm aiming to hear from you about 3 top universities in terms of the number of faculty members they had. And I would love to get your thoughts or answers just on this row.
Anyone want to give it a shot? You're free to unmute yourself and give an answer.
Hi, John.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's Jena in Heidelberg.
Yeah.
The third one might be Geneva.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly right. So the top 3 universities on this row are, as he said, we call University of Vienna and Heidelberg and Geneva. Now, the University of Vienna was in Germany, established in 1557, and it was a great Lutheran university back in the day. So it trained lots of Lutheran pastors and theologians. And the University of Heidelberg was, of course, in Germany too. And it was a much older university. It was actually established in 1386, very, very long time ago. And it still exists in Germany and is the oldest university in Germany. And you know, that's one of the places I would like to visit when I go to Europe later. And during the 16th century, it was known as a solid Reformed university, Heidelberg University, that is. And 2 of the most well-known professors from this university were producers of the famous and the beautiful the Heidelberg Catechism in 1563. So this is a very significant Reformed university in the early modern period. And you know, knowing more about the history of this university will help you understand bigger about European Reformation in the day. Now, how about Geneva? Geneva, I'll come back to this institution shortly, but let me quickly say that this was founded in 1559 under the leadership of John Calvin. So Calvin basically founded this academy in 1559. And when this was first established, and after that as well, this academy was the place to study Reformed theology. So if you wanted to learn under some of the greatest Reformed theologians, you know, in the early or the mid or later part of the 16th century, you would probably sell all your belongings and come to this place to study theology. It was that big. And that's how Genevan Academy attracted students. It just possessed excellent faculty. But for now, let me move on and let's look at the middle right here. And again, I want you to identify 3 universities that had the most number of faculty members from this one here, third one.
Who would like to give it a shot? Hongi was raising his hand earlier.
Yeah. Go ahead, Hongi.
Hongi, you want to give it a shot?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Yeah,
you.
Hongi.
Oh, yeah, sweet. Okay. Where are we? Sorry, guys.
Not so good.
Okay, so on the third one, we've got, I think it's, I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Leipzig?
Yeah, Leipzig, that's good.
Yeah, Marburg.
Marburg. Sorry, I can't hear you, Hongi.
Is it Leiden?
Exactly, Leiden. So thank you. So Leipzig, Marburg, and Leiden. So we got 3 universities here. Now, the Leipzig University was significant in the history of Lutheranism. It was founded in 1409. And if you know a little bit about Luther's history, this was the city, not the university, but the church in the city of Leipzig that Luther had the famous dispute, the Leipzig Disputation. Now, the Marburg University, or Luther was there as well for colloquy to meet with Zwingli, to come to agreement, about whether Lutheranism and the Reform can join to form a unified Protestant movement. It failed, but basically the city of Marburg was the city when Luther and Zwingli met together to discuss those points. Now, Marburg University had both Lutheran and Reformed scholastics. It was founded in 1527, and of course, both were in Germany. Now, for our purposes, I want to highlight that the University of Leiden in the Netherlands was one of the most influential Reformed universities after Calvin, because some of the students from the Academy of Geneva, who studied under Calvin, basically went on to become professors at this university. And we'll get to one of the students of Calvin named Franciscus Junius in our third part. But for now, let me just note that this university was very significant in the history of Reformed tradition, and especially in the history of a Dutch Reformed tradition. And this university was where Jacob Arminius, the father of Arminianism, taught theology as professor. And this is the place where he got into serious trouble in the early part of the 17th century. So this is an important and interesting school in the history of Reformation. Now, we've noticed some of the important universities in the early modern period, and let me share with you some of the important professors and curricula that shaped Reformed theological education in the day. So let me click Geneva. Okay, we're going to Geneva. Now, as you can see, they had, at least according to what the PRDL team had found, they had 4 faculties. Faculty of Arts, you would study undergrad program by these professors here. You would, if you are enrolled, you would first study grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Basically, you would learn everything about using verbal words or written words. These are the professors who basically would teach you how to use language, how to speak all after that, you would go on to study law, medicine, music, and theology as well. So, but these all theologians who studied at the Academy of Geneva would have a prior training in the arts, language, basically logic, things like that. Now, for our purposes, I want to look at the Faculty of Philosophy and Theology. By the way, if you look at the list of theologians here, you can see that the number-wise, it's much bigger, it's larger. They had many more theologians than they had philosophers. So let's look at the Faculty of Theology for now. And I want to show you, by the way, these are the number of works that we have from the scholars here. And the most prolific writer, at least according to what the PRDL had found, was a guy by the name of Julius Pacius. Let's click him and have a look at what he produced. Now, Pacius states here, and you see he was the professor of law, Heidelberg, philosophy at Geneva. Later, in other places, he moved around because, you know, there were lots of religious persecutions. And as I said at the beginning, depending on the direction of the state, the university had to change their direction as well. So theologians had to move around quite a bit. Now, if you look at the titles of his works, what stands out? You don't need to understand everything, but I think if you just read some of the names there, I think one thing stands out, I think. What do you think, what stands out, or what was the main area of his engagement for Pacchius?
Aristotle.
That's exactly right. So you don't need to know the Latin to see that he is basically engaging with Aristotle's work, right? Now, I want to show you one of his works. Where is this? Yeah, here we go. Institutiones Logicae, basically institutes of logic or basics of logic, whatever you call it. And if you look at this, can you see the screen, like this page? Yeah, oh, good. This is Pacchius's Institutes of Logic, Institutiones Logicae, and it's published in 1615. And if you scroll down, you don't have to understand all these things to, for now, let's just look at the table of contents here. And if you look at this, you will see de basically means concerning or about in Latin. So de logica, it's like concerning logic or about logic. So you will see that Pacchius dealt with logic, categories, you know, interpretation, syllogism, and the details of syllogistic thinking here. And all the way down, more syllogism, science demonstration, causation, method, like how to do whatever you want to do in terms of teaching, learning something. More syllogism, you know, dialectic logic, you know, sophistry. This is like how to spot errors and logical fallacies. Now, I show you all these things to just help you see what you would learn at the academy. If you were to study theology, you would have read and studied, you know, logic texts like this. And what you would study is basically a refined and you know, reformed you know, works on Aristotle's logic texts. So it's not surprising. So when you read Reformed scholastic literature, you will see lots of Aristotelian categories, and that's partly because they studied that as they studied philosophy and as they studied logic. So the way they understood how language works, how to divide arguments, how to form arguments, they all learned that through Aristotle's texts. And the philosophers, the Reformed philosophers, did not just use Aristotle. They refined them, they reformed them. So it's not Aristotle verbatim that they learned and taught, but the kind of logic, Aristotelianism, that was refined and reformed after decades of theological engagements. So I wanted to show you what you would learn from a philosopher at the Academy of Geneva. And just, I want to show you one more scholar, not Pacchius. And if we can go down, I want to look at one more person from the Faculty of Theology. And this guy has a cool name, Antoine Rodolphe Chevalier. He was professor of Hebrew. And if you click his name, not many works, but what I want you to see is this work, Rudimenta Hebraicae Linguae, or basically the basics of Hebrew language. And you would study Hebrew under theologian because, you know, everyone who wanted to, you know, enroll for the undergrad, not everyone was, you know, going to be theologians. So you would study this under theologian and by the Faculty of Theology. Let's look at his works. Chevalier, cool name. Chevalier, Rudimenta Hebraicae Linguae. So accurate method, or in a brief way of writing or something like that, I think. If you go down, this is title page. Scroll down. Table of contents. Yep, this is the table of contents. Now you can look at this Tractatus Primus, first part, and it's got 4 chapters. 4 chapters here. Primus. Secundus, second part. Quite a lot of chapters. 1, 2, 3, all the way down to here. 23 chapters under part 2. Tertius, part 3. You would have, or he had, 10 chapters. Fourth part, just 2 chapters. And this is the actual writing. This is how they learned Hebrew, theologians in the early modern period. This is remarkable. But anyway, I share all these things to show you that when Reformed philosophers were engaging with Aristotle and other philosophy, biblical scholars, if you will, were advancing language studies so that students could read and interpret the Bible directly from the original languages. So when you hear that Reformed scholastics were rationalists or something like that, that's actually incorrect in my view, because the Reformed scholars in the universities were working with all kinds of academic disciplines, not just logic, not just philosophy, but also philology, language as well. So yeah, if I can go back to the PowerPoint. Now, this is the last picture I want to show you. This is the picture of the library at the University of Leiden in 1610. And just tell me what strikes you, what's different from modern libraries. And just to get you going, if you look at the top of each bookshelf, you will see how they cataloged the books, like mathematics, philosophy, 2 rows of philosophy on the left, literature, about two rows, I think, and the other rows were bookshelves were theology, Theology, or something like that. You will see that. On the right, on the top of the bookshelves, you histories, and all the way down, probably music, but I'm not sure. I can't just recognize the words. But anyway, what strikes you here? What's different about the library life, so to speak, back in the day, compared to our modern library?
Well, if I may, it looks like there are, I think those are standing tables on in the front of the bookshelves, and I suppose maybe even in the other bookshelves after that they might have that as well, maybe.
Yeah. So I actually don't know why they were standing or why they made it that way, like how they were incorporated in the libraries. That's a good point. That's definitely one thing that's different from modern library. Another thing, maybe?
I think it looks like they have.
Sorry, honey, I think I'm having lagging.
And I think it's quite verbal because of the actions. If you look at the picture, those 4 in the bottom right corner there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I think.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying it looks like they're having
a loud conversation.
Yeah. So
I think that's what Homie was trying to say. They're very active down there, unlike what you see in the library today.
That's right. So you will see that it's paired up. People are paired up into 2 groups, or just you see two people here and there. It's just they're paired up, and the key. So that's one of the key differences, or I would say this is one key intellectual culture of Reformed scholasticism. What you would do in the library is for professors and students to gather together and discuss and share conversations. Now, according, in our modern library policies, we are not allowed to make noises at library, which is good. But back in the day, as Hongi said, they were active, and you could even see dogs here. The dogs are moving around, and so they definitely had a different library policy back then. But I just wanted to notice that the Leiden University the University of Leiden library was very active and filled with people having conversations, walking to each other, talking to each other. And that's actually one of the key differences between monastic forms of theology and scholastic form, because monastic form of theology was heavily geared towards personal meditation and devotion. It was to nurture your reliance on God and to deepen your relationship with God, but it was geared towards the heart, if you will, monastic form of theology, because its main focus was to main focus of monastic theology was to learn theology so that you can love God more. But if you look at the scholastic way of learning theology, as you can see in the picture, it was just thinking, talking, discussing, refining, analyzing. So it was scholastic theology was definitely more conversational, and you would even say disputational. People argued about ideas. And some people see this academic form as a negative one because it's heady and not so warm. But it played a significant part in the history of Reformed tradition, because it was these scholars who gathered together and produced confessions. It wasn't the monastic form it wasn't the theologians who just liked to meditate theology for personal reflection. It was scholars like them who wanted to pursue precision in the way they thought about theology, in the way they expressed theology. So these professors basically produced a very lasting and tangible legacy for the church, although they were very, conversational and sometimes argumentative. So, in closing, I wanna share this quote from Richard Muller, and just wrap up part one. And probably we're gonna have a break after this. So this is what Richard Muller how he explains the Reformed scholasticism. This double continuity, meaning continuity with medieval methods, but continuity with Reformation doctrines, this double continuity ought not to be either surprising or disconcerting. Instead, it ought to be understood as one example among many of the ways in which the church both moves forward in history, adapting to new situations and insights, so at the same time retains its original identity as the community of faith. It ought to be understood as one example of the way in which the Christian intellectual tradition maintains useful forms, methods, and doctrinal ideas, while at the same time incorporating the advances of exegetical and theological investigation. So the key to understanding the relationship between, medieval scholasticism, Reformation, and Reformed scholasticism is two things. Reformation doctrines on the one hand, medieval and Renaissance methods on the other. Content, doctrinal content, continuity with Reformation. Methodologically speaking, though, the Reformed university professors followed Renaissance and medieval practices when they thought about, when they argued, and when they taught theology. So this is basically the summary of part one, and I'm going to open the floor for questions, but the summary is Reformed scholastics advanced the Reformation by reforming academic theological education. And if you can remember what we looked at through, the rudiments of Hebrew language by Chevalier, that kind of advanced language training, especially in Hebrew, was not available in the medieval ages. Even if it was less developed. But because of the Renaissance, humanism, Reformed scholastics could indeed develop a much better refined understanding of the original languages. So all this is to say that Reformed scholastics advanced the Reformation forward by reforming academic education. Now, this is the end of this part one. And before we have a break, I just want to ask if you have any questions.
we do have a couple of questions that have been sent to me, John. I'm going to stop your sharing so we can see you on the big screen. So one question from Kyle is regarding the relationship between John Calvin and scholasticism. So maybe looking backward and looking forward. And he mentioned in his question that he noticed that in John Calvin's works, he would sometimes say some negative things regarding the medieval scholastics. But I assume that the Reformed scholastics are very much seeing themselves in line with John Calvin. So how does that relationship work out?
That's a great question. Much ink has been spilled on this very issue. And the relationship between Calvin and medieval scholastics is a complex one as well. But the Richard Muller that I introduced to you, what he could find was if you actually trace the use of scholastics in Calvin's works, you will see that Calvin was referring to a specific group of scholars. And these group of scholars were based in Sorbonne, France. So Calvin was not just going against the whole medieval age. We're going to look at a little bit of that in the third part. Calvin was not going after the whole medieval theology and the whole way of doing theology in the Middle Ages, but he was criticizing a portion of them, and specifically those who taught at the University of Sorbonne in France. So Calvin's relationship or his criticism against medieval scholastics, that's very narrow. It's not like everybody. I have to say that on the one hand. And on the other hand, the students of Calvin did actually had a better understanding of what medieval theologians argued for than Calvin actually did. If you read Calvin's works, Institutes, you will see that Calvin cited lots of patristic fathers like Augustine, Tertullian, whatever. And we, of course, will get to some of that in the third part. But he didn't cite many medieval theologians. And it was because he was trained as a humanist, and he basically preferred to engage with the fathers from the classical period, because that was his strength and that was his main expertise. But as Reformation moved forward, his students dug deep into the medieval literature and found that the patristic, for example, Augustinian insights on grace, they were not rejected by all medieval scholastics. It was retained by some of them at least. And actually Calvin and his students could go further. So Calvin's students could go further than Calvin in terms of discovery and discovering the same Augustinian trajectories in the medieval period. So yes, Calvin did criticize lots of scholastics, but it was targeting specific groups, not every scholastic. And on the other hand, Calvin had limited knowledge of medieval scholastics compared to how much he knew about patristics. But his students, again, could read much more widely, in terms of medieval sources, and they could identify and find that, hey, these Augustinian insights were present in these medieval scholastics as well. So, yeah, I don't know whether that answered your question, but
no, actually, Kyle just messaged me. He says he's very satisfied with the answer. He literally messaged that. So we've, unfortunately, we've only got time for one more question. Ilya's got his hand up, but we'll have to get you for after the break, Ilya, if that's fine, because I got one lined up right here. And it's a simple question, but yeah, tell me what you think. Hongi is asking, how did these schools, that whole list of schools that you're talking about, how did these schools swing so far left? I think he's observed that many of the schools that are listed there have very much gone the route of liberalism.
Oh, yeah. So, sorry, I think I had some lagging. What was the question itself? Sorry.
Sorry, how did these schools end up swinging so far left?
That's a great question. Now, in the case of Geneva Academy, if you look at the early part of the 17th century, it was still solid as a reformed academy. You will see Francis Turretin. I'm going to share some of his thoughts later on. Turretin represents the most mature he was basically one of the best scholastic theologians in the Reformed tradition. But after him, though, it was actually his son that wanted to have a loose subscription to Reformed confessions, and he wanted to seek the coalition, so to speak, with other Lutherans and other branches of Protestant churches. And he wanted to have lesser grip on the role of Reformed confessions in academies. And since then, because of his, for instance, Turton's son, and in other places too, the liberalization kind of began when they somewhat lost the string grip they had on the Reformed confessions. So confessional laxity, so to speak, was one of the reasons how these Reformed universities became, later on in history became liberal. But the starting phase was almost always had to do with confessionalism. It's because, as I said, universities were supported by church and state. And if both churches and state had a very loose attitude toward confessions, then the educational vision of the schools, it was just up in the air. So so confessional fidelity, laxity, that's one of the key reasons that determine the future of these academies.
Great insight. Yeah, thanks for that question, Hongi. So we're about to go on a break. I want you to know also, John, that there are participants in here that I can see by their names that are currently Bible college or seminary students. So I would love to hear some more from them as well, because this is something that definitely they should be thinking through in terms of the relationship between their church and the academy. And the questions are really great, guys. Keep them coming. If you didn't know, John is actually doing his doctoral study at the Free University of Amsterdam on one of John Calvin's students, which is why he loved that question from Kyle. And that student is Franciscus Junius. And I have a feeling he'll tell us a little bit more about him. But anyway, it's 4:03 here in Melbourne, 4:04. So if you could come back at exactly 4:10, so 6 minutes. Okay, come back at exactly 4:10. That's 6 minutes from now, and we will begin right away. And for the people in Manila, that is 2:10. Okay, so see you in a bit. Okay, time is up. We shall continue with the second half of John's lesson. John, could I ask you to turn on your video so we could see you?
Sure.
Thank you. So we have one question before you continue, though, if that's okay, and it's from Ilya. And his question is, why is it that the Renaissance and medieval scholastics thought that it was necessary and good to split from the monastic tradition, the monastic theological tradition, given that it's already been established for such a long time?
I think one reason, that's a great question. I'll have to dig into more history. But one reason was because of geographical reasons too. Monasteries were usually placed or located in rural areas, whereas universities were located in the more, urban areas. So because of that, at least for the state, in order for universities to train not just theologians but also civil servants as well, they did not look for rural areas, monastic, schools to provide that kind of education. And so geographically speaking, it wasn't easy for the state to choose monastic schools and designate that place as a center of, universal learning, so to speak. But that's a great question. I have to look at some other reasons as well. But this thing just comes to my mind. So I don't know whether that would trigger you to find more answers.
Thanks, John. That's it for now. So you may proceed.
Yeah. All right. So let me share the screen. Okay. Now, can everybody see the screen again? The slides? That's good. By the way, I'm wearing this jacket because it's quite cold in my room. In Melbourne, it's quite cold. It's very windy here. So I just wanted to stay warm. So the second part is Reformed Scholasticism and Confessional Theology. Of course, the topic is broad, but we have only a limited time, so I'm just going to sketch broad strokes. And we're going to get to the details in our discussions or whatever, but I'm just going to sketch the broad picture. Now, one example I want to focus on today is a Reformed scholastic who wrote one of the most enduring Reformed catechisms. His name is Zacharias Ursinus, and he's the author of the famous Heidelberg Catechism. That catechism was written in 1563, and I assume you all know this wonderful catechism. And Ursinus was a professor of theology at the University of Heidelberg in Germany during the 1560s. And also important is his commentary on the catechism, which you can see on the right. So it's available in English as well. So if you want to know the deep and technical and profound exposition of the catechism, this is the place to go. The author's own commentary on the catechism that he produced. So his interpretation, his exposition, I have to say, is the normative. This commentary functions like a normative rule when it comes to understanding the distinctive Dutch Reformed, classical Dutch Reformed theology. And this is what Ursinus wrote in the introductory part of his commentary. And if you can see the slide, can I please ask someone else, not me, someone else to read this for us?
Yeah, I'll call someone out.
Yeah.
Anthony, Trinidad, if you are there right now, would you care to read this page?
Sure, Josh. The system of catechizing, therefore, includes a short, simple, and plain exposition and rehearsal of the Christian doctrine, deduced from the writings of the prophets and apostles, and arranged in the form of questions and answers, adapted to the capacity and comprehension of the ignorant and unlearned. Or it is a brief summary of the doctrine of the prophets and apostles, communicated orally to such as are unlearned, which they again are required to repeat.
That's great. Thank you very much. So let me ask you, everybody, so what is the Heidelberg Catechism according to the author, Ursinus himself? What's the substance of this catechism, if you will? So what is the Heidelberg Catechism, basically, if you were to answer the question?
Anyone is free to try to give a response to that. Go ahead, Ian.
Is it a brief summary from the looks of it?
Exactly. So that's exactly right. So using Ursinus's own words, catechism is a short, simple, and plain exposition and rehearsal of the Christian doctrine, or as you said, it's a brief summary of the doctrine of the prophets and apostles. So this catechism is a doctrinal exposition of the Bible or summary of biblical doctrines. Now, another follow-up question is this. This is quite easy to see because I highlighted a few things. How did he summarize the Christian doctrines contained in the catechism? So what methods did Ursinus use to systemize Christian doctrines into a catechetical form?
Questions and answers. In the form of questions and answers.
Oh, sorry?
Form of questions and answers.
Yeah, that's one, definitely. So his method of systematization, so to speak.
Deduce from the scriptures.
Exactly, that's another one. And the last one is basically, adapting that whatever content that he can draw from the Bible to the capacity and comprehension of the ignorant and unlearned. Now, so we see, three methods that Ursinus used here. First, deduction. He deduced from the writings of the prophets and apostles those doctrines. And second, arrangement or organization organization of that doctrine or those doctrines in the form of questions and answers, and adaptation, or we can say accommodation to the capacity and comprehension of the ignorant and unlearned. So these are the three methods or techniques, if you will, that Ursinus used to summarize the whole doctrinal teachings of the Bible into a catechetical form. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on what Reformed scholastic theologians meant by the term deducing doctrinal truths from the Bible, deducing. And we also see in the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 1, paragraph 6, the similar confession as well. The whole counsel of God concerning all things necessary for his own glory, man's salvation, faith in life, is either expressly set down in Scripture, or by good and necessary consequence may be deduced from Scripture, unto which nothing at any time is to be added, whether by new revelations of the Spirit or traditions of man. So we see here that the method of deduction became a confessional method, an official method of both the European Reformed and the Westminster Divines as well, the Presbyterians. And I thought I would spend a few minutes saying a few things about what they meant by deducing doctrines from the Bible. And understanding this principle will help us understand why the Divines and people like Ursinus contain the number of doctrines they did in the confessions, because the principle of deduction extends biblical doctrines, but also limits the boundary of those doctrines as well. So we'll get to a little bit of that just in a second. Now,
John?
in Scholastic, yeah?
Sorry to interrupt. Before you proceed, we actually had a really relevant clarification that you might be able to tackle. Our friend Matt is simply asking, what's the context of ignorant and unlearned when Ursinus says he accommodates it to the ignorant and unlearned?
Yeah, so if I can go back, I think the hint is there, the last sentence, communicate orally to such as are unlearned. So because many people were illiterate back in the day, when Ursinus meant, unlearned, ignorant people, I think he meant illiterate people who can't read, who can't proceed, who can't just process lots of reading materials. So when he accommodated, so to speak, adapted these things to the capacity of the ignorant, he was thinking about, communicating this orally to the people there. So I think it wasn't like they were having brain damage or whatever it is. It's just that they just could not read and probably could not read the catechism on their own. So they had to be orally communicated. I think that's the context of that. All right. Now, in scholastic logic, typically necessaria or necessaria, depending on what pronunciation you use, necessaria or necessary things are contrasted with possibilia, possible things, and impossibilia or impossible things. And the necessary things or the necessary consequences had the force of, oughtness, like mustness. And it's necessary not because, not merely, the conclusions that could be drawn from the Bible had to be necessary, not merely possible or probable. So the necessary conclusion was something that was mandatory, obligatory. And we might even say that it's inevitable. I mean, these doctrines' conclusions are inevitable, considering certain preceding premises. So when Reformed scholastics talked about deducing ordinary consequences from the Bible, they not only believed that, what they concluded through logical reasoning had to contain biblical premises. That's true, no doubt about that. But they also believed that those conclusions, even though they might be based on biblical teachings, or have biblical references, those conclusions had to be necessary, meaning that they had to be certain and mandatory, not merely possible or probable. But the question is this: how do you deduce necessary conclusions? How do we reject impossible and possible conclusions in the first place and come to necessary conclusions? And here's the thing. When the Reformed scholastics thought about deducing necessary doctrines from the Bible, they thought that all conclusions must be grounded in the literal sense of the Bible. Literal sense of the Bible. It's typical of the Reformed scholastics to argue that all doctrines must be grounded in the literal sense of the text, and all conclusions must be deduced from the literal sense of the text. So one of the gigantic Reformed scholastic theologians named Francis Turretin, argued this as he was a professor of theology at the Academy of Geneva, where Calvin founded. And his theology, as I said before, represents one of the most mature versions of Reformed scholastic theology. And he stated this regarding the Roman Catholic interpretive position, principle, so to speak. So like we did before, Josh, could you have one person read this for us, please?
Yes, sure. Could we have Gio Kadungog, if you're there, could I have you read this page, please, if you're available? Gio might not be there at the moment. We can get a lady, actually. Anacleta, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here, sure. Okay. The papists, in order to force upon us another visible judge of controversies, the Church and the Pope, besides the Scriptures and the Holy Spirit speaking in them, attribute a manifold sense to them and hence infer that they are doubtful and ambiguous. Therefore, they distinguish between the literal and the mystical sense and divide this last into three parts: allegorical, topological, and agogical. Allegorical, when the sacred history is transferred to things of faith, as what is said of the two covenants or Sarah and Hagar. Anagogical, when the words of Scripture are applied to the things of future age, as what is said of the rest. Tropological, when transferred to morals.
Thank you very much. You pronounced it perfectly. So anagogical is correct. So thank you very much. Now, so Turretin argued here that Roman Catholics wrongly believed in a manifold sense of the Bible. The Roman Catholics believed that the mystical senses of allegorical, which was for faith, of anagogical, which was for hope, and tropological or moral, which was for love. And they argued that the allegorical, anagogical, tropological senses of the Bible were equally authoritative in doctrinal formulations as the literal sense. So both literal and mystical senses were the grounds of theological doctrines according to Rome. And as you can see in the first sentence here, because Rome believed that the Bible had multiple senses, they argued that ordinary people could not find all these senses from the Bible. So the Bible was not clear, was not perspicuous. And we need a visible judge, the Pope, to settle theological issues when they arise. So Turretin wonderfully summarized the position of the Roman Catholics here, and when it comes to biblical interpretation. And the question is, what's Turretin's response to that? And I would like to have somebody to read this for us as well, if possible.
Yes, Jai, could you read this page, if you will?
We thus think that the only one true and genuine sense, the literal sense, belongs to the scriptures. That sense may be twofold, either simple or compound. Simple and historical is that which contains the declaration of one thing without any other signification, as the precepts, the doctrines, and the histories. And this is twofold, either proper and grammatical, or figurative and tropical. Proper, arising from the proper words, tropical from figurative words. The composite or mixed sense is in prophecies as types, part of which is in the type, part in the antitype. This does not establish two senses, but two parts of one and the same sense intended by the Holy Spirit.
Thank you, that was great. Basically, this is the summary of what Turton is arguing here. The Bible has only one literal sense, or the given text has one literal sense, and it can be distinguished into different kinds, but it's nonetheless one sense. It's simple when it comes to like histories and certain moral precepts, do this, don't do that. And the history, for example, like the fact that Moses was the leader of the old covenant people, that's historical fact. And that's quite simple. And you should, in formulating biblical doctrines, you should consider that simple truth as well. So all these things are subsumed under simple, the aspect of the literal sense. Simple further into grammatical figure, like symbolical, the figure can be symbolical. So when it comes to simple, understanding the simple sense, simple kind of the literal sense, language plays a heavy part here. Grammatical, symbolical expressions, you have to know the language there. Also compound, certain biblical doctrines have typical or typal aspects, like the Passover, and sorry, I'm a Presbyterian, so maybe circumcision had a relationship with baptism in the New Covenant. So whatever it is, the typal, typical aspect and antitypal aspect, this needs to be considered in formulating doctrines, but nonetheless, they had to be grounded in the literal sense. And what we have to notice here is that Turton believed that the literal sense is not grammatical or linguistic. I mean, that's part of it, but that's not all of it. The word literal sense, according to Turton and other Reformed scholastics, was the sense intended by the Spirit. So we can say that the literal sense is the spiritual sense, in the sense of the Holy Spirit's intention. So he writes this: distinguish the sense of the scriptures from their application. The sense is only one, whether simple or composite. Thus allegory, anagogy, and tropology are not so diverse senses as applications of one literal sense. So when we proceed from the sign to the thing signified, we do not introduce, this is critical, we do not introduce a new sense, but educe what was implied in the sign so as to have the full and complete sense intended by the Spirit. So this is what the Reformed scholastics thought about the method of deducing. They were not introducing new doctrines like Roman Catholics did, but what they did was educing or deducing, drawing out what was already in the Bible, what was already implicitly taught in the biblical teachings. So all doctrines, whether explicitly taught and discoverable simply by appealing to the grammatical, linguistic aspects, or implicitly taught in the Bible, like typical antitypal relationships, all doctrines must be grounded in the literal sense, in the point intended by the Holy Spirit. So doctrines must be grounded in God's own revelation, and the scope of necessary doctrines must be delineated by the scope of God's special revelation. That's how they thought about deducing doctrines. And that's how they ended up having the number of doctrines that they had in the confessions and catechisms. It was by understanding the literal sense of the Bible and limiting what they ought to believe by understanding the literal sense of the text, indicating their reliance on the special revelation intended by the Holy Spirit. That was critical. Now, given the time we have, I'm going to skip all the parts, but Richard Muller is saying here that it was typical for the Reformed Orthodox to insist on a single, literal, grammatical meaning of the text, and to argue that no extrapolated allegorical, tropological, or anagogical sense of the text can ever be a firm basis for theological formulation. They might have practical benefits, edification, but no matter how edifying or spiritually invigorating those senses or explanations may be, they cannot be the foundation of doctrines. So both philology, this is my point, philology language and philosophy, like logic and thinking beyond what we find in the languages of the Bible, both philology and philosophy helped reform scholastics to develop the system of biblical doctrines. Now, if I can go back to this, a quick point I want to make is that, Ursinus thought the need to form this catechism and to teach this to the ignorant and learned, so that they could be edified in their faith, so that they could grow in their faith as well. And this is more explicitly taught in this passage. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but here Ursinus is saying that in the primitive church, this is how Ursinus understood the history of catechesis or catechetical education. He said in the primitive church, there were two classes of these catechumens, or people who engaged in catechetical teachings. The first were those of adult age, and the other class was for the small children of the church, or the children of Christian parents. Now, I'm not sharing this to make a point about infant baptism or anything like that, but I'm trying to draw out the point that when Ursinus, as a renowned professor at the University of Heidelberg, when he was, summarizing biblical doctrines, codifying them, organizing them, he was thinking not just the adults, but he was thinking about the children as well. So I think Ursinus gives us a good example of an ecclesially oriented theologian, an academic, who doesn't just think about adults, but also children as well. And I think this is exemplary for us, as we teach, as we pursue theological learning. How strong do we desire to connect with the children as well in our churches? And are we intentionally investing our time and energy to reach out to them and help them grow in their faith as well? Or are we just, delegating all the roles to their parents and somewhat detaching ourselves from their lives? But I think if we look at many Reformed scholastics, Ursinus is just one example. They were ecclesial theologians, so to speak, churchly theologians, who thought about instructing the unlearned, but also the children as well. So summary of this part is that many Reformed scholastic theologians, like Ursinus, were positive contributors to the development of confessional Reformed theology. Now, before we go to the next part, I want to open up for questions as well. So Josh, do you want to let me know if there are any questions or?
Yeah, sure. So far, there's no extra questions in the chat box, but we'll give you guys a few seconds to either raise your hand or unmute if you'd like. The floor is open for a few questions. I did want to mention that one of my friends, JB, who lives in New Zealand, reminded me earlier that when I was mentioning all the times, we can't neglect New Zealand, right? It's like 6:37 p.m. in New Zealand right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so hi, JB. And John is actually a New Zealand national. I don't know if you guys knew that, but he is a New Zealand national. But he currently lives in Melbourne, so we took him. So none at this point, John. No one's raising their hand at this point. So you may continue. You've got another portion to cover, so go ahead.
Yep, sure. Now, the last part before conclusion will be on this Reformed Scholasticism and Catholic theology. Sorry, I'm rushing a little bit because I'm conscious of the time, but please feel free to ask questions at the end. I'd love to, stay here longer and share conversations with you if that's okay with you. So Part 3, Reformed Scholasticism and Catholic Theology. Now, as we begin, I would like to open this session with this question. Who are your favorite theologians from the 16th and the 17th centuries? Anyone, please. Even Josh?
I'll begin with John Owen.
Yep, John Owen, really good theologian.
Go ahead, guys. We'd love to hear your favorite theologians from 1500s, 1600s.
Theodore Beza.
Beza, fantastic, yeah. Beza was an important theologian at the Academy of Geneva after Calvin's death. And he's one of the few second-generation reformers who survived until the beginning of the 17th century. Most of the reformers died, Beza died in 1570s, I think, but most of the second-generation theologians, including Calvin, died in 1560s. So Beza did live a little bit longer, and his influence was extended beyond Calvin's life. So good. Anyone else? Probably one more.
Yeah. How about people we haven't heard from? Josh or JB? Let us know.
Hello there. John Knox.
John Knox. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's great. So I guess that you're a Presbyterian.
Yes.
No, that's good. That's good. So yeah, we
From
have
a,
John
Christian Reformed Church in New Zealand.
Oh, okay. So John Knox, John Owen, and Theodore Beza, all good. The next question: who were their favorite theologians? I want to hear from you on this. Because just like we have our own theologians, they must have had their own favorite theologians as well. So, I mean, who influenced them? Who shaped them, do you think?
For John Knox, if I'm not mistaken, it was Calvin, right?
Yes, Calvin, for sure. And we can say to a certain degree that Theodore Beza, John Owen was influenced by Calvin. But other than Calvin, perhaps, maybe if you can share one more person other than Calvin, who are their favorite theologians?
Beza had cited Anselm and Augustine.
Wow, Anselm and Augustine, that's great. Yeah. That's great. So yeah, the reason why I asked the second question is because we don't often know enough about who influenced our own favorite theologians. We like Luther, we like Calvin, which we should. We like John Owen, we like, John Knox, we like many other Puritans, but we are not so sure about who influenced them or who shaped them. And, here is one value of asking the second question. If we can know the favorite theologians of our own favorite theologians, then the obvious point is we can learn from them too, right? We can learn from Anselm, we can learn from Augustine, we can learn from, John Calvin. And, if Calvin was heavily influenced by Augustine, which he was, then we can learn from Augustine too. So, I want to show you this. I want to show you how much Calvin relied on Augustine. And this is what Calvin said in his work about Augustine. He said, Augustinus totus noster est. Augustinus totus noster est. And what he meant was Augustine is totally ours. Calvin said that Augustine is totally ours on the issue of God's saving grace. And Calvin was confident that on the issue of grace, Augustine was completely on his side. Against Rome and other semi-Pelagians, Calvin claimed that on the issue of grace, free will, salvation, or basically the monergistic nature of God's saving act, on that topic, Augustine was completely on his side. That's how heavy Calvin relied on Augustine. And there are thousands of references, referenced and unreferenced citations of Augustine in Calvin's work. So there is no doubt that there was a very high degree of reliance on Augustine in Calvin's theology, no doubt. And in Calvin's work called In the Bondage of the Will, Calvin basically makes this point as well. Augustine teaches that the human will is indeed free, but only to will evil. And we can skip that sentence. Therefore, God is not induced by our preparation to bestow his grace on us, but in every way, God goes before us, so that the beginning is in his pure mercy. And basically the whole passage just tells us that Augustine taught, which Calvin affirmed, that in order to will or choose something good in God's sight, that grace is necessary, that we cannot do that because of our corruption. And this passage, or basically the point made in this passage, this is what we typically mean when we say the Augustinian roots of Calvin's understanding of grace. Basically, by the way, the background is that one Roman Catholic theologian named Albert Pigius published a work criticizing John Calvin's views on grace, and basically John Calvin responded by publishing this work. So this is just focused on the bondage of the will and the role of God's grace. Now, here's the thing though. Not many people notice this, but Calvin did not just read patristic sources, meaning church fathers, but he also read medieval sources. And this medieval monk by the name of Bernard of Clairvaux was a big influence on Calvin's theology, especially on grace and free will. And this is what Calvin said in his Institutes. Bernard, agreeing with Augustine, so writes, "Among all living beings, man alone is free, and yet, because sin has intervened, he also undergoes a kind of violence, not of will, not of nature, but of will, not of nature, so that not even thus is he deprived of his innate freedom. For what is voluntary is also free." Now, Bernard of Clairvaux was a French monk who lived in the 11th and 12th centuries. And the saying goes that, this is historically backed up, that when Bernard joined the monastic community in the city of Citeaux in early 20s, all of his 5 brothers, a few of his relatives, and more than 30 of his friends joined the monastic community with him. So he was definitely a leader, and he had lots of followers. And through their conjoined enrollment at the monastery, that monastery was soon revitalized and gained popularity in France. So he was a big figure during his own life and also after his death in the development of monastic life. Now, let me ask you a quick question. This is a very simple question. Why did Calvin like Bernard? Why did Calvin quote Bernard here? Very simple question.
Because he agreed.
Because they agreed with Augustine.
Yeah, I think both of you were getting at the same point. Calvin quoted or liked Bernard because Bernard agreed with Augustine, right? He liked Bernard because he agreed with Augustine on the issue of grace. And I think this indicates to us then there were some reliable Augustinians in the Middle Ages too. The medieval period was not completely filled with semi-Pelagians who believed in the combination of works and grace in salvation. There were people there, but like Bernard, there were some people who continue to pass on the teaching that God's grace is monergistic, that salvation is by God's grace alone. And to understand this a little bit more, I want to introduce to you a Reformed scholastic by the name of Franciscus Junius. Junius was a Frenchman who first studied law and then studied theology under Calvin at the Academy of Geneva. And he pastored churches in Europe and served on the theological faculties of two of the most important academies of the time, the universities of Heidelberg and Leiden. And when he was professor at the University of Heidelberg, he was a colleague of Ursinus as well. So this Junius was an important figure after Calvin. And if you know Kuyper, Abraham Kuyper, Kuyper said that Junius taught everywhere. This is how high Kuyper regarded Junius. If you look at the 17th century Reformed theology, you will see Junius's ideas, categories, distinctions almost everywhere. So Junius was very important. And this is the quote that we have from this work on Treatise on True Theology. So can I again, please, if it's okay with you, can I please have one person read this for us?
Yeah, Matt, I know you're there. Could you please read this page?
Okay. Moreover, what the Orthodox Fathers and the Scholastics who follow their steps handed down very well was commonly known, namely, that the natural gifts have been corrupted and the supernatural ones lost. So from this statement, we establish that supernatural theology, which by the sin of man had been, as it were, rejected and most undeservedly spurned, retreated from here to the heavens, and natural theology, as all the other things which arise from nature, was corrupted. For how could it have remained uncorrupted in a subject that was corrupted in every part?
Thank you very much. That was great. Now, if we can just spend a minute analyzing this excerpt, what do you think is the main thesis here? I think it's relatively straightforward. What is the main thesis Junius is trying to affirm here? I think, if I can just interrupt, I think the main point that Junius is trying to affirm is that the natural gifts have been corrupted and the supernatural ones are lost. So he's saying here that the twofold consequence of the fall was, one, corruption of natural gifts, and two, deprivation or dispossession of supernatural gifts. So corruption of natural gifts and dispossession or deprivation of supernatural gifts. And if you look at the whole work, by this he meant that due to the fall, the whole human soul became so corrupted that it doesn't think and will in a right order, but always thinks and wills in disorder. And the fallen nature still possesses the ability to think and will, for example, but they are so corrupted that the natural gifts of thinking and willing, the gifts that God gave to human beings, the image bearers of God, those gifts no longer function properly. And on top of that, he argued that supernatural gifts of loving God and obeying God above all things have been lost due to the fall. Or as you put it here, they were retreated from here to the heavens. So man, by his own disobedience, rejected God's grace. So if you read his writings, you can see that he employed a traditional way of seeing the consequence of the fall into corruption of nature on the one hand, and deprivation of grace on the other. Corruption of nature, deprivation of grace. And the second question is this. I should, for the sake of time, I should probably answer them myself. In whose writings did he discover this truth? In whose writings did he discover this truth? And the answer is right here. He found it from the Orthodox Fathers and the Scholastics. And he even said that the Scholastics who follow their steps, the steps of fathers, handed down very well that which was commonly known by the fathers. So I'm making this point to show you that Junius found Augustinian understanding of grace, not just from the fathers, plural, but also from the Scholastics, again, plural. It wasn't one theologian that he could find this teaching from. It was many theologians from the Church Fathers and the Scholastics. So this is what Richard Muller says about this after observing many different theological works. Reformation era and Reformed Orthodox exegetes came to the task of biblical interpretation, not as isolated scholars confronting the text armed only with the tools given to them by Renaissance era philology. Philology functioned very importantly, but that was not everything. They also assumed the importance of the voice of the church, particularly in interpretive conversation, both positive and negative with the living exegetical tradition. So, and they did that they appealed to the authorities from the fathers, medieval scholastics, not in the Romanist sense, but as sound sources of advice and precedent. So, the Reformation moved forward in the 16th century. The Reformed scholastics dug deep into the Church Fathers and medieval scholastics as well, and found sound advisors on exegetical and theological issues, and establishing the Catholicity, the universality of their theology was important not only for their identity. I mean, as reformers broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, it was important for them to establish their Orthodox identity. So this Catholicity was important for their identity, but also for their unity, because it wasn't just them alone who invented all these doctrines. They acknowledged the precedence of their theology, and to establish both their identity and unity, they pursued a Catholic knowledge, if you will. So going back to Calvin and Junius now, what we learned from the Reformed theologians like Calvin and Junius is that they learned from and relied on the Church Fathers and medieval scholastics, medieval theologians. So what we can do as Christians wanting to deepen our appreciation of the Reformed legacy, we can first of all read the actual writings of the Reformers, like Luther and Calvin, and also other Reformed scholastics, so that we can see the rich fabric of Catholic theology expressed in their works and also in the confessions they produced. So this is the summary of part 3. Many Reformed scholastic theologians were positive contributors to the development of Catholic theology, development of universal and united theology, the theology that has precedence in the patristic fathers, but also in the medieval scholastics. Now, I hope that was, not complex. I hope the points that I made were simple. And before we go to conclusion and basically wrap up, I'm just curious about whether you have any questions. So any questions?
We've got none for now, John. So I think it would be good for you to conclude, and if there's remaining time, we'll open it up again.
Okay, sure. Now, the conclusion. I just wanted to avoid reiterating the main point. The main point is the Reformed scholastics were positive contributors to the development of Reformed confessional and Catholic theology. And another conclusion I wanted to draw was that Reformed confessions were foundational to 3 institutions in the Reformation period: churches, states, and universities. And, because of the separation between church and state these days, we don't appeal to the state to accept Reformed confessions, right? But how about seminaries that still train ministers for Reformed churches? Do the academies and do the seminaries need to adopt Reformed confessions or not? What approach should they have towards confessions? I think this is what are the practical questions that we can think about as people who appreciate Reformed confessions. So to reiterate the conclusion, or the practical point, Reformed churches and academies can build a healthy relationship when both hold fast to the Reformed confessions. Confessional fidelity does not solve all the problems, does not guarantee good relationships, but I still think that confessional fidelity should be the formal basis upon which Reformed seminaries and Reformed churches should relate to each other. So I want to extend the use of confessions, not just, I don't want to limit that to the life of the church, but I want to extend that to academies as well. And I really hope that many Reformed seminaries become more genuine heirs and promoters of Reformed confessions, so that churches and academies can sustain good relationships. The question is, how do we as lay people participate in that kind of pursuit? And I think a quote from Bavinck is really helpful here. All good, enduring reformation begins with ourselves and takes its starting point in one's own heart and life. And I'm going to skip the body part and the conclusion. By reforming from within can be undertaken by each person at every moment, and they can be advanced without impediment. So my encouragement to you is, instead of just hoping for churches and seminaries to get along well, I think what we can do is to just by ourselves, we can appreciate the Reformed confessions. We can read Reformed scholastic works. We learn deeply about the confessional theology, Catholic theology there. And we can extend this love into our family members, our own circles, our churches. And in that process, I think we can be in a better place to pursue healthier relationship between academy and church. So thank you for listening today, and thank you, Josh, again for giving me this opportunity. And I hope God will bless you in your study of theology as well.